Hey guys, welcome to another video here on the AviationPro channel. In this video we're going to take a look at the differences between flying in the US versus Europe on VATSIM. Now when you're, for example, flying across the pond event, when you're flying from Europe to the US or vice versa, you enter a totally different region, and there are some subtle differences here and there that make flying into another region than you're used to more challenging. So in this video I will cover 10 things that are different between flying in Europe and the US. And yes, I know there are other regions as well, like South America or Oceania and Australia, for example, or Africa and Asia. But I think, the Europe and the US, most people fly there, and, given VATSIM's biggest biannual event across the pond, I think it makes more sense to cover these differences. But knowing these differences will definitely help you in other regions as well, because personally I find other regions are kind of a mix between the two usually. Now the first thing that you will notice that is different is the call sign pronunciation. For example, when you have a flight like this one, FedEx 684, in Europe the call sign would be pronounced as FedEx 684. However, in the US they tend to kind of combine the numbers and pronounce a call sign like this as FedEx 684. Or if you look at another flight right here, for example, Envoy 3426, as it would be pronounced in Europe, is pronounced as Envoy 3426. So that's a little bit of a difference. So when you're flying in Europe, for example, and flying to the US, your call sign like KLM 641 may turn into KLM 641 by the time that you arrive in US airspace. Now, do you have to adjust your way of pronunciating the call sign? Well, I personally do so. For example, when I'm flying KLM 641, I am indeed saying KLM 641 by the time I arrive at, for example, the Gander Oceanic controller. And I think that's the best habit. Just make sure that you adapt to the local situation and the local differences. And, it's a bit challenging maybe to identify and hear your call sign in a little bit of a different manner. But just be aware that the air traffic controllers over in the US and Europe pronounce your call sign differently. The second thing to consider is that there are other slight phraseology differences. Now these differences are kind of subtle, but you will immediately notice them as soon as you talk over the VATSIM radios. A big one is, for example, in the US they use points instead of decimals in order to split frequencies, right? So a frequency like 1 to 1.8, a ground frequency on Europe, would be called 1 to 1.8 in the US. And this is another thing that you just have to adapt to. So when you're flying in the US and you're pronunciating the frequencies with a point, make sure you switch over to decimal when you're flying in Europe. And there are other subtle differences, like maybe you might hear the controller say something descend and maintain or climb and maintain in the US, while in Europe the controller might just say climb flight level 120, for example. Or when you're getting in touch with a radar controller in Europe, you might hear that the controller has identified you, while in the US they will say radar contact. So, it are these little subtle differences that you will hear. So make sure that you're aware of them and try to adapt as much as possible to the local situation. Now the third point to consider, which ties in with radio communication, is the accents. Now the accents are going to be a big factor when you're flying on VATSIM, and I bet also in the real world. Because if you're flying in the US all the time and you suddenly fly to Europe, you will be hearing different accents. The English language sounds different in the Netherlands, in the UK, in France, in Eastern Europe. So it might, be a little bit difficult to adjust to that. And same if you're flying in Europe, the American accent is quite clear. It's maybe quite easy to understand, but you will notice that the people there, maybe talk rather fast because it's their native language. They know, what to say and what to say when. So keep in mind that the controllers in the US, if you're used to flying in Europe, might talk a little bit faster than you're used to, so it may be a little bit harder to follow. And as a US pilot flying in Europe, make sure you just try to understand the controller as much as you can, even though the accent might be a little bit troublesome every now and again. And another thing that might happen with that, sometimes you will hear people also speak their local language on the frequencies. So don't worry if you suddenly hear someone talk French on a French radio. That's something that will just happen. It's not really good for situational awareness, but don't freak out when you cannot make out what's happening, But as long as you just use the English language, you'll be alright. Now let's take a look at a few other differences, and these differences are related more to weather. So point number 4 is that the METAR in the US and in Europe look a little bit different. For example, the visibility in the METAR in Europe is reported in meters. So for example, when you see 9999, it means that the visibility is 10 kilometers or more. Or if you see 2000, it means that the visibility is 2 kilometers. In the US, however, the visibility is reported in statute miles, so regular miles. So that's a little bit different. You might find more differences between the METARs here and there. So make sure, if you do not understand what a particular portion of the METAR says, or maybe a TAF report is a little bit different than you used to, just make sure that you look it up so you know what the exact differences are. And the fifth point to keep in mind is that in the US and Europe, they use different units to indicate pressure. So for example, in the US, you'll be flying using a so-called altimeter setting in order to make sure that your altimeter shows the correct altitude, which of course dependent on the pressure around. So for example, low pressure area or high pressure area. Now in the US, they use inches of mercury. So for example, the standard altimeter setting is there 2992 inches of mercury. While in Europe, we use something called hectopascals, and that's a so-called QNH setting. So the default QNH setting in Europe, the default altimeter setting is 1013. So these are just different units, and in the aircraft that you're flying, you will find a switch which allows you to switch between inches of mercury and hectopascals, so you can adjust your altimeter. And in more conventional aircraft, usually the altimeter also has two sides. One side where you can see the units in inches of mercury, and other side where you can see the units in hectopascals. So make sure you're aware of this. So for example, when you're flying from the US to Europe, that you switch to hectopascals as soon as you enter European airspace, or descending into European airspace. Now tying in with this is point number 6, and that is that there are differences between transition altitude and transition level between the US and Europe. So as you know, the transition altitude is the level at which you on climb, on departure, switch from the local altimeter setting or QNH to the standard altimeter setting or QNH. And the transition level is the point where you switch from the standard or in QNH or altimeter setting to the local altimeter setting or QNH when you're arriving at an airport. Now in the US, it's rather easy. The transition altitude and the transition level are 18,000 feet or flight level 180. So that's the same across the entire country at every single airport. So keep in mind when you're flying, when you used to fly in Europe, that you have to switch to the standard QNH, for example, quite late on during the departure, and that you have to switch to the local altimeter setting quite early on the descent. Because in Europe, this is different. In Europe, the transition altitude differs per country and sometimes also per airport. And the transition altitude is usually indicated on the standard instrument departure charts. So if you take a look, for example, at this departure chart at Amsterdam, you can see that the transition altitude is 3,000 feet. So already at 3,000 feet, you switch from the local QNH to the standard QNH of 1013 hectopascals. Or for example, here at Prague, you can see that the transition altitude is 5,000 feet. Now, as for the transition level, in Europe it's also different. You will not be able to find it on the chart, but it's reported on the ATIS because it depends on various factors, I believe, like the pressure and the the temperature at the airport. So in order to get to know the transition level at the airport you're flying into, you have to listen to the ATIS. Now, of course, you might wonder, as a US pilot, if you're flying in Europe, what if there's no ATC and no ATIS online? Well, indeed, then you don't really know the transition level. What I personally just do is look up a departure chart, take a look at the transition altitude, maybe at 1,000 or 2,000 feet. And based on that, you kind of at least generate some sort of altitude where you're going to switch from the standard QNH to the local QNH. As long as you make sure that by the time you join the final approach, like an ILS approach or an RNAV approach, that you're really flying on the local QNH, because by the time you are on the ILS, usually that's the point where you really want to make sure that you're flying on the local QNH, so that all aircraft are flying at the exact same level and are capturing the glide slope, for example, at the exact same altitude. And then on to difference number 7, and the upcoming differences will relate a little bit more to flying. Now, first of all, the pushback is a little bit different in the US, because in the US you don't really have a ground controller which takes care of the gates. In the US there are actually separate ramp controllers, and these ramp controllers really take care of what's happening at the the terminal building and at the gate. So a ground controller is really only to guide you through the taxiways and guide you to the right runway. But for the final portion of the taxi, when you are going to dock into a gate, you will be contacting a ramp controller. And the same for the pushback. In Europe, the ground controller takes care of all this. The ground controller will assign you a gate upon landing and also clear you for pushback. But in the US, this is not always so, because there's usually a separate ramp controller which will take care of the pushback in real life. Now the thing with VATSIM is that there are usually not ramp controllers online. Usually they're just ground controllers. So basically that means you will be able to initiate the pushback on your own. However, do keep in mind that during some events, especially at larger airports, sometimes actually the ground controller will actually provide pushback clearances. So if you're unsure about whether you actually need to request a pushback clearance from ground in the US, make sure you just ask via a private text message so you're absolutely sure, because you can imagine when it's very busy and people are just randomly pushing back, it creates a mess on the ground, which normally would be guided by a ramp controller, but that the ramp controller is not there on VATSIM. But when it's a little bit less busy and there's no specific event going on or not a lot of traffic, you should be able to push back on your own. At least that's my own experience with my flights in the US. So do keep in mind when you're flying all the time in the US and you're suddenly flying into Europe, that you will be assigned a gate by the ground controller, and you will actually have to ask for pushback clearance at the ground frequency, so that you're not just randomly pushing back without any clearance. Really make sure that you keep that in mind, otherwise the ground controller will probably not be very happy with you. And difference number 8 is that the SIDs and the stars in between the US and Europe can differ quite a little bit. Now if you take a look at this route, for example, flying from Geneva to Amsterdam, the route just starts with a waypoint and ends with a waypoint. And the start of the waypoint is usually where the standard instrument departure takes you in Europe. So you're just flying out of a runway, really following a specific route with maybe some speed restrictions or altitude restrictions, and then you arrive at the first waypoint on your flight plan. Same for the star. For example, this flight plan ends at Norku. So basically, when you're flying into Amsterdam, you're going to be flying the Norku to Alpha arrival, which takes you to this waypoint R-tip, at which the controller will take over and vector you to the final approach. Now in the US, this is usually a little bit different. Usually on standard instrument departure, you fly particular transitions. So basically, you might get vectored initially by ATC and then transition onto your waypoint. And for the star, you also may be flying transitions, and the nomenclature is a little bit different here and there. So as you can see on this route from a real-world flight, KLM 641 from Amsterdam to New York JFK, you can see that the aircraft is flying via Kennebunk and then following the Parch 3 arrival. Now the Parch 3 arrival actually takes you to the waypoint Parch, at which you further continue your approach. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a different naming in there. So keep in mind that the general layout of SIDs and stars in the US will be different, and that something that is called a transition in the US might look more like a star in Europe. Or for example, if you have an airport like Frankfurt, you also have transitions there, which just take you from your final waypoint all the way down to the final approach point of the ILS to a particular runway. So when you're flying in the US or Europe, it might be a little bit confusing as to what is called a transition and what is called a star. But as long as you make sure that you study the charts and just make sure that you know where you're going, and at least make sure that your route is correct with all the restrictions that may be there, then you'll be fine. But just keep in mind that in flight plans in the US, if you look, for example, at routes that you can find on FlightAware, which, by the way, great website if you want to look up routes for flights in the US, you will see that actually a transition or an arrival is included as part of the flight plan. While in Europe, this is usually not the case. Flight plan just starts with the first waypoint where the standard instrument departure will take you, and then ends with a particular waypoint where the arrival route starts. So keep that in mind. Now again, tying in with this is point number 9, and it is that in the US you're more likely to get vectors, especially on departure. In Europe this is not very common. In Europe it's actually very common to fly particular standard instrument departures, but in the US you might often see that the first waypoint on your flight plan does not tie or connect to with any standard instrument departure. And this basically means that the controller will just provide you vectors, and what will happen on takeoff, as you receive your takeoff clearance, the tower might instruct you to fly a particular heading. So don't freak out when you hear that. It might just be that the tower controller will give you a particular heading, and then as you switch to the departure controller, you will be given a new heading in order to get you to your first waypoint. While in Europe, the controller might just give you a takeoff clearance and expect you to fly the standard instrument departure as you were cleared, when you obtained your flight plan clearance at delivery. So make sure you keep that in mind for departure, but also for arrival in the US and in Europe. It's kind of the same. Usually you just fly a particular arrival route to a certain waypoint, and at that point you will receive vectors. But especially the departure can be quite a little bit different. So for example, in an airport like Chicago O'Hare, there are not any particular departure routes. There's just a map of waypoints, and you will be flying a particular heading or flying the runway heading until you get further instructions. So ATC is a little bit more in charge there in terms of separating traffic on departure. And the last point number 10, is that in general the charts look a little bit different, and it's really, really, really important, as you can imagine from judging from the last points, that you really study the charts. Now, of course, if you have something like a Navigraph subscription with Jeppesen charts, overall the charts will be more easy to interpret. But especially if you're using, charts from aeronautical information publications like official, charts by the aviation authorities from the different countries, it will look different. So charts in the US will look quite a little bit different. And if you're used to US charts, you will enter a mess in Europe, because each and every country in Europe designs their own charts. So charts in the UK will look a lot different from charts in Italy. And I have to say, some countries are, a little bit difficult to read the charts from. So make sure that you keep that in mind. If you're not using a Navigraph subscription and you're just getting your charts from FAQ websites or AIP websites, that it will be more difficult to read those charts. So really take the time to study them in order to fully get a grasp of what's going on your departure route, for example, or your arrival route. So there you go. Those were 10 differences between flying in the US and Europe. If you have any particular other differences that you've noticed, make sure you leave them down below in the comments. I would be glad if you could share your knowledge with us, and it's always much appreciated. Now, I don't fly in the US that much myself, but these were the differences that are most apparent to me, and that you will probably be facing as well. So in general, it's really slight differences in phraseology, slight differences in procedures, especially during the departure, and weather related differences like METARs and altimeter settings and transition levels or transition altitudes. So I think those are the main 3 categories you have to keep in mind when you're switching between flying in the US and Europe. And I'll say it's great fun. It's really great to explore a different region, especially if you're flying across the pond. You will just notice that those differences immediately, which is really a nice, a change of pace of when you're really used to flying in a particular region. So I would definitely encourage you to try this. If you're new to VATSIM, I would highly encourage you to just stay in one region for the first, a couple of flights until you really know what you're doing. Because if you're flying in another region again, it will be more difficult to adapt. So really just take your time, practice in one region, and then slowly start to explore other regions. Because of course that's what VATSIM is about. There are a lot of different controllers out there, a lot of different countries that are active. So make sure you explore those countries, and also other regions like Africa or South America or Asia or Oceania. There's a lot to choose from. So I'd like to thank you for watching this video here on the AviationPro channel. Make sure you check out some of my other content, and I wish you great fun when you're flying the Cross the Pond event or when you're flying in the US and Europe. I hope these few points have helped you out. So I will see you next time, and take care.